Alright, so this is kind of a weird random video, but I wanted to talk about this because I was just thinking about this a lot right now, and I think I've made a slight breakthrough for myself, anyways, about the subject matter here. It's talking about this question that comes up. I've heard people ask, are video games art? Can video games be art? Um, and that sort of that sparks a lot of discussion. There's been definitely a heated debate um, about this topic of can video games be considered art or can they not be art, or is it some of them can, parts of them are. There's a lot of that going around, and I guess that debate has fallen off a bit more in recent years, but the bit of a breakthrough I guess I've had here is thinking about this, where the biggest comparison that happens a lot is comparing video games to something like film. And generally, the big problem with that is the idea that what makes a film good does not necessarily make a video game good. Generally, films do have to rely a lot on the narrative, which also makes them more comparable to something like novels. In fact, like most films, I think, are built off of the groundwork that was done with novels in the first place. So it's very easy to compare those two and be like, yes, these are both forms of art. But video games can have a great narrative and still not be a very good game, or a game could, be just a great game, an amazing video game, and just not really have much of a narrative to speak of. Um, and just because there's not a great narrative in Pac-Man or Tetris or something, like, doesn't mean that those games aren't great or a form of art. And it's just that they're different, and the way that they're done is different. The way that the form of art works is not the same. It's not based in narrative. It's based more in things like how it interacts with the player, because it's an interactive medium. What you get out of it based on how you have to interact with the game, and the way the game makes you feel based on the culmination of all these different factors. And the way I usually look at that also, to kind of expand that, is to think of, well, what about music? Something that makes for a good song doesn't necessarily make for a good movie either, because they're two different forms of art. You don't have to have a strong narrative in a song. You can have a totally instrumental song that is just very much open to interpretation. You can have an abstract painting that someone standing right next to you can be looking at the exact same painting and get something totally different from it, because there's not really a strict narrative to that either, or it's not really about the narrative. It's about how you're interacting with that, how it's making you feel, what you're thinking about when you're seeing it. And so, again, like, just because something that makes a film good, or a painting good, or a song good, all those things are usually different from one another. But that doesn't mean that they're not still forms of art. Generally, people would still say, yes, film is an art form, and music, that's an art form, and paintings or sculptures, and photography. A number of things of these other things are all art forms, even though they achieve their goals in different ways from one another. What makes them good is not it's not all based around the same thing. They're all equal art forms. They all count as art forms. And so it's weird to say that video games don't count as an art form, even beyond the simple idea of, beyond the simple defense of, like, anything is art if you think it's art. There's I think there's more to it than that also, and I think another reason that I've heard a lot, and this is kind of the breakthrough I had here, is that the thing I hear a lot is the defense of saying that, well, video games have art in them, but they aren't art. And the concept there is that, like, yes, there's, like, visuals, be them, like, drawn or generated or whatever. There are the visuals, there's visual art going on, there's music in video games, there's that art, and sometimes there are stories being written in there, and dialogue and whatnot, and so there's maybe some voice acting, there's performance art, there's There's the narrative to it. There are a lot of different pieces of art that come together, but because it has the word game in it, they don't think that that counts because it's a game. Um, and there are, plenty of things in the music industry and the film industry that are done to make money and aren't really done as a means of art. But there are still oftentimes artists behind these things with artistic intentions also. So to kind of downplay things for money and the trivialization of these, I think is a little harsh to also just pin on video games and then discount the form entirety because of that. But also, you look at a film, and you can say kind of the same thing, where there's still things like, paintings and sculptures for set designs. There's music being played for the scores and themes of film. There is, and it's like, photography and multiple other forms of art coming together, the writing of it. It all comes together in this way that, yes, they're all separate forms. When they're all isolated, those are their own forms of art. But you put them together in a film, and the way in which they're done is its own form of art. And that's the same thing with video games. You put together these different aspects that are all considered art on their own, and the way they interact with each other and the way that you then experience them is how that also transforms into art. And I think that that is something that maybe is kind of lost because it's just lost in the shuffle, lost in the mix, because a lot of the time the perspective of someone who is trying to say that video games are not art is not the perspective of someone who is trying to really think about, is it? It's usually coming from the perspective of someone trying to say that it's not and figuring out some kind of definition or classification, some way to make everything they already believe to be art to still stay as art so their argument sounds sound, but also to then just specifically exclude video games so they can be correct about this for whatever reason. It depends on the person. I don't really know what the point would be to say, like, prove, like, they're not. But to say that they are, I mean, a lot of times that's also from a biased standpoint. Obviously, I am a big fan of video games, and I feel like I understand there is a lot of artistry in there, and the way it comes together. That's also why I, like to try and review video games and talk about these things, that kind of the way they work and how they work with the player and affect you, and the way they have this special interaction, and the special way of getting across their themes and their messages and the emotions and the responses, all that. There's an art to that. And I think that if you're someone who is actually truly on the fence, it is worth looking at and asking yourself, do you think that these things come together and create a unique form of art? Or do you think that it just doesn't count? And if not, I would love to know why. I'd love to know other people's opinions if you want to leave comments or messages or whatever. That would be cool too, because I think it's an interesting discussion. But I just had these few thoughts rattling around today, and I figured that was a big point that I guess I never really considered before. That is oftentimes the way that, video games get kind of excluded a lot. And I don't know, it's not even necessarily something to, it's not something to get mad about. I'm not, like, angry. I just think it's an interesting thing to think about. And it is strange to me, I guess, as someone who can have such a connection with video games and see them as this art form, to see other people who can appreciate other forms of art so easily discount this one. Largely due to people who don't really play or care about video games that much. Mostly it's probably the disconnect there. But I don't know. I guess I just think it would be nice to be given the same level of respect, even if you don't have the same level of understanding or appreciation yourself. So that's my weird ramble that I had. I don't know. Hopefully that was kind of interesting and not. Hopefully it didn't suck.